The WWH show. This is a show that asks a series of why, what, and how questions on issues that have national, regional, and global significance and implications. We have such a topic today: why the current food aid and development aid programs are not benefiting the poor in Ethiopia. I have a privilege to discuss this topic with Dr. Aklog Birara. He's an expert. He used to work with the World Bank. He has written books and articles about this very topic. Dr. Aklog, thank you very much for coming.
It's a pleasure, Dr. Asagid.
This is the second time to have discussion with you. I enjoyed the first one we had about good governance. Today we're going to talk about why the current food aid and development aid programs are not benefiting the poor in Ethiopia. But I remember last time I had a discussion with Dr. Gabe Hamda. He's an Abesha. So when we were talking about in English, some people commented that, hey, you guys are Abeshas. Why didn't you made it in English, in Amharic rather? I understand, but we do it in English because you and me are Abesha, we understand Amharic. But we do it because our primary target audience are the second generation Ethiopians, people from other cultures, most importantly, the international community who have interest in Ethiopia. The current government, they spend millions of dollars to sometimes even mislead and cheat the international community to promote their faulty and not working bad policies. Why don't we discuss in English and promote, some advocacy workers using the English language, which could be understood by the international community. Don't you agree on that?
Dr. Asagid, I think first let me thank you and Isat for the privilege of talking about a topic that is absolutely critical. I think targeting second generation Ethiopians whose primary language is English, and as important, the foreign community is absolutely critical. And we'll show why it's so critical. We can't simply be inward looking. We have to be outward looking. So I'm really delighted that this pioneering work of really talking in English and one-on-one has been started by you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. That being said, let's give them a little bit background about why we should discuss about the food aid and development aid programs. Right. As you know, billions of dollars have been channeled between the developed nation into other developing countries, including in Ethiopia. But we know that for decades, this program hasn't brought any meaningful change. Poverty is still there. If we take today's Ethiopia, the living cost is skyrocketing and people are in difficulties to live, and also the inflation rate is high, poverty is alive, the system is not working. So we have to discuss about, if this program is not benefiting the poor, why don't we change it? So the discussion is based on this fact that poverty is still alive. Aid programs have been there, but they haven't brought any change. So the first question we should address is why poverty is still there, why Ethiopia has been dependent on food aid and couldn't be able to feed herself.
Dr. Asagid, when you asked me to come for this one-on-one, I reflected a little bit about the importance of the conversation 30 years after the Great Famine of 1984. And I like to sort of start with a premise that hunger, as the president of Brazil said, is the greatest mass destruction in the world, because without hunger, there can't be peace.
Would you please say it again?
What he said precisely is, when he was president, he was concerned about hunger in Brazil and in other developing countries. And so he was addressing the parliament, and he said, hunger is the greatest mass destruction in the world.
So true.
Without alleviating hunger and eliminating destitution and hunger and poverty, there can't be peace. That's what he said. So it's befitting really to talk about why 30 years after the Great Famine of 1984, Ethiopia is still the world's largest and consistently dependent country on food aid. The world's largest recipient of food aid. Why? 30 years. So I think it's befitting to talk about that. Is it a systems issue? Is it our culture? You know, are we lazy? Is it the people?
Is it the policy? Is it the leaders?
Is it the policy? What is it? That's a fair question. And we can't, Dr. said it. The thing is, whether we want it or not, whether we like it or not, poverty is what drives many young Ethiopians out of Ethiopia. Poverty is the reason why people really find the current government's governance unacceptable. Because poverty is not only about going hungry at night. Imagine that. Happening to you or to me each night, to our children, to our mothers, to our fathers, to our sisters, each night. It is an assault on human dignity because nobody wants to be dependent. Nobody wants charities all the time. Ethiopian people have dignity. Whether you talk about Amhara, whether you talk about Tigray, whether you talk about Oromo, whether you talk about Somali, all of them share something in common. Dignity, honor, being free and independent, being self-sufficient. The current system has not eliminated destitution and poverty and hunger. People have a hard time eating 3 meals a day.
But you brought a very important point here. People are not being able to eat 3 times per day. But remember the late Prime Minister Meles Zenawi, who said that our goal is to make sure that Ethiopians eat 3 times per day. After 23 years, people are still poor. They're not eating, the majority of Ethiopians are not eating 3 times per day.
Right.
Poverty is there, and he died even before alleviating and before he kept his promise.
Yeah. I think, what really amazes me and appalls me is that Ethiopia have had a successive of repressive regimes that didn't make the people central to the development architecture. People have to be the decision makers. At least, by that I mean they need to participate in the decision-making process, in the policy-making process, in the program process. When Prime Minister Meles and his party promised that Ethiopians will have 3 meals a day, to me, that was a wonderful vision. But a vision is different from action, isn't it?
Exactly.
I mean, if you translate it into action, it means that by a certain period of time, 20 years, this government has been in power for 20, going to 24.
Yeah.
Okay, if the Koreans can do it, if the Vietnamese can do it, if the Indians can do it, if Israel, which is a desert, can transform the desert into prosperous, farms, why can't Ethiopia? Is it a systems issue, or is it a natural phenomena? It's not. I like to point out, and we'll discuss this more. To me, it's not a people phenomena. Why do I say that? Dr. Asagid, history teaches us that Ethiopia was the first African country to develop farming. Young people should know this. Ethiopia is the first, I repeat, Ethiopia is the first country that developed farming. If you develop farming, it behooves you to improve it, to be a custodian to the land.
Exactly.
I grew up in a farm, where we had full self-sufficiency. Today, if my parents were alive, they will not be food self-sufficient. Why? the land has been completely fragmented. More people. The growth rate hasn't kept up with population growth. One of the tragedies, Dr. Asagid, that you and I need to discuss, and the audience ought to know, and the world community ought to know, is that the Ethiopian government, despite the fact that it promised wonders to transform Ethiopia into a breadbasket because it has water, it's the water tower of Africa, right? Mm-hmm. If you are a water tower of Africa, if you have lands, if you have hard-working people, if you have history, why wouldn't you be able to feed your own population?
Yeah, why don't you fight poverty and become prosperous? Exactly. So the question now is, the dependency on food aid program is not because of the people. The people are hardworking. As you said, Ethiopia was the first country to develop farming. Right. So it's not about the people. No. And we can say that it's not about the environment and the soil, because there are other countries like Israel and other countries in the Middle East and so on. They are feeding themselves even if the natural atmosphere environment is not favorable. So the question now is this the leadership issue, which means the mindset of the leaders to think like we cannot develop ourselves without food aid? Or is it because of their greed and corruption that they want to keep on getting food aid so that they may abuse it, use it, or maybe even punish other people who are not supporting them? So the dependency on food aid program and development aid program might be because of the system, which is the policies, the infrastructures, and so on and so forth, and also because of the leaders. Because always, I am a leadership expert, and one of the things that I believe is that things fall on leadership. I mean, if the leadership can make it great or can make it bad. So it's about the leadership. So now the problem we have is not the people, the land, it's about the leadership.
I suggest, just along the lines that you are stating, it has nothing to do with the environment. It has nothing to do with the fact, I remember in 1984 when this great famine took place, Geldof, the famous singer, will come, to this, perhaps later when we talk about the global community and so on. He said, a country of no rains, no rivers, and all that. He sang. And, but it's not a country of no rains. It is a country of rains. It's not a country of no rivers. There are several rivers. We are building some of the largest dams in the world because we have rivers, right?
Yep.
It's not a country where people are, as I said, lazy. I remember growing up on a farm, my parents worked from early morning to late evening to support themselves, This is the Ethiopians that I know. The culture is really amenable. However, we need to ask the question, why, for example, Prime Minister Meles, when he was alive, as soon as he took political power, he came up with a development formula, agriculture-led industrialization. When you look at it conceptually, it's beautiful. Agriculture-led. It means the vast majority of the Ethiopian people are farmers and rural. More than 80% still.
Yeah.
The urban population is only 17%. So if you depend on agriculture for your exporters, for your livelihood, it behooves you to identify the bottlenecks that constrain productivity and employment. Is it policy or is it not? It is policy. Policy means government leadership. Yeah. Is it enabling, empowering, or debilitating, arresting?
In our case, we could say that it's debilitating.
It is debilitating.
It discourages productivity, it discourages innovation, and so on and so forth. We're going to come up with a solution, because this show is about asking why, what, and how. So we're going to talk about how to fix it. So now let's proceed to the next question we should address, which is, why then, if the food aid program is not delivering, if the development aid programs are not delivering, then why the international community, donor nations and organizations still keep on giving food aid and developmental aid to a country, to a leadership who couldn't be able to deliver their promises? why the international community
That's the central
uses
question.
food aid as in the fight against poverty.
It's a central question. And, you know, I really like for young Ethiopians, and there are many of them, because the vast majority of Ethiopians are youth below the age of 40. And many of them are well-to-do and live, you know, many, hundreds of thousands of them live overseas. Look, why does the international community, you know, first of all, we need to sort of ask the question, why does the donor community claim that Ethiopia is doing wonderfully? Why? Why? Is Ethiopia doing wonderfully? No. By the conversation we had, the couple of questions we discussed, obviously it's not doing very well because there is hunger, there is famine. 60% of young children are either starved or stunted. Wow. Their growth is affected. That's a huge percentage. 60%. Even by the admission of the Ethiopian government, 40% are. But experts estimate that it is much higher. IFPRI, for example, estimates that. Oxfam estimates that. The World Bank had a major study, you know, when I was at the bank before I retired, called Poverty in Ethiopia, Agriculture Agency, and which did a marvelous job. So the question it asked was, why is Ethiopia still poor, and why, you know, why are we sort of dismissing this question of a vicious cycle of dependency? The reason is because I think in 1984 there was a legitimate case for the world community to respond to us.
Yeah, there was a disaster.
There was a disaster.
Yeah.
It's a human thing.
Yeah.
You know, people were, you know, we lost something like 800 to 1,000 to 1 million people, more than Rwanda, right, during the genocide.
Yeah.
You know, if in fact hunger is a form of genocide, as the Brazilian president said, then why has Ethiopia been continuously dependent on food aid to the tune of 700,000 tons a year for 10 years?
And why the people who are giving this food aid continue to give to a government who couldn't be able to deliver their promises?
Why wouldn't they make the government accountable?
Yeah.
Why wouldn't they say? Why wouldn't they say? Well, look, I don't think, you know, your country that has enormous potential. It has a talent, a human talent pool. You have an agricultural tradition. Look, really, you need to reform. You need to reform fast. You know, for example, agricultural ownership. The state owns the land.
Ridiculous.
Ridiculous.
How can you invest on a land which is not yours?
Thank you. Anybody, any individual, young people should you will know this. You know, when we say you need to have land security, you need to own the land on which you are producing. It's not only the produce, the land should be yours. You know, that is not the case in Ethiopia. The agricultural sector has basically been left out, sort of to perform at a level that's biblical. That's really amazing, isn't it? In the 21st century, most Ethiopians use implements that most people find sad. You know, you need to improve the productivity of agriculture. You need to cater to the environment. You need to provide inputs, extension services. You need to diversify. You need to establish factories, agro-industries, in order to absorb the surplus labor that, you know, many millions of Ethiopians in the rural areas are either land poor or landless.
So now,
many millions.
Yeah, of course, you know, with this all important changes that the government is not making, the question now is why the international community push the government, make it accountable. Now, as far as I'm concerned, the government is not in the position where it says, hey, I will do it my way, keep on giving me the food aid and the developmental aid. It can't, because they even consider food aid and development aid to budget
Yeah.
So without food aid, without developmental aid, the government doesn't have even a budget for a single year.
Yes.
So they can leverage that. They can use that to influence the government. We're not saying bypass the government, because it is impossible that the international community or donor organization can go to in Ethiopia and say, hey, we don't care about you government, we don't care, we just do it ourselves. It's not practical. I wish if it was the case, but it's not practical. The government should involve. The question is why they don't make the government accountable, suggest, for example, third parties to make the administration of the food. Of course, the government can participate in terms of where the food should go, and also establish committees to make sure that things are done appropriately, and follow up, monitor, and so on and so forth. But the administration part should never been given to dictators, because they use it, manipulate it, abuse it. So why the international community doesn't make the government accountable,
well, let's
and
talk about
suggest
that.
third parties to administer the food aid program, for example?
Let's talk about that. I remember asking this question when the World Bank was pumping in money, ever since the TPLF, EPRDF took political power. Ethiopia has been a darling of the donor community for a very, very practical reason: self-interest. After all, remember, globalization works in mysterious ways. What it advances normally, and I know this because the World Bank used to debate it, globalization. How democratic should it be? Is it democratic or not? It's not democratic. There is no single independent thinker who accepts the notion that globalization, foreign direct investment, foreign aid works democratically to support the poor, or to liberate a country from poverty, to empower the domestic private sector, for example. There is self-interest. If you just imagine a graph, the rate at which foreign aid and humanitarian aid has been growing in Ethiopia relates to 9/11, for example. Why? The growth of foreign aid and other forms of concessional as well as non-concessional aid has been rising from rapidly from 2005, the election of 2005. Why? So I think self-interest is one of the reasons. One of the there are a number of experts who have written, studied the subject of food aid. Chadowski is one of the best who has written about globalization and poverty. There is a guy by the name of Mills who has written the same thing. Why is Africa poor? Others, Human Rights Watch, development without freedom. All of those, Auckland Institute, so many, IFPRI, the Global Forum, all of those. All of these have written. Now, the question you asked, and we need to discuss even more, is why then is the donor community not pushing the Ethiopian government to reform? In part, because according to the World Bank, for example, which is the largest donor, they don't intervene in political affairs of a nation. That's their argument. Imagine this. If they don't intervene in the political affairs, if they are apolitical, how come they were not giving aid to the Derg? How come they were giving aid to a dictator in Kenya, Arab Moi, or to Mobutu, or to the dictators in Indonesia, and so on? There is a political dimension to foreign aid. We can't escape the conclusion that foreign aid serves self-interest, whether it is humanitarian or not.
So now the question is, okay, now because we can debate, maybe they may not listen to us because they are the one donating.
Right.
So let's say they couldn't be able to make the government accountable 100%.
Right.
But at least why don't they try to influence the government not to abuse human rights?
Right.
because now the government in Ethiopia abuses the food aid itself.
Yes.
They give food aid to their supporters and punish people who are dissenters.
Right.
So why not at least they make them accountable in terms of human rights, abuses and so on and so forth?
Well,
even if they cannot really totally exclude them from the system, why don't they at least ask the government not to abuse human rights?
There is no easy answer. As I said, self-interest is very important, and it works in a very subtle way. Of course, when I say that there is a collusion between foreign aid, Western aid, and the Ethiopian government, Chinese aid, concessional aid, and commercial loans, and the Ethiopian government, what governs that relationship is self-interest, national interest. At the same time, it is not totally true that they don't voice opinions. I used to ask this question of senior management at the World Bank: why don't you raise the governance issue? They raise it in a different way than sort of direct intervention of saying, look, change the regulatory framework. Promulgate a law that will enable farmers to own their land. They say they can do that. What they do is, basically in their analytical work, they show constraints in terms of productivity. The World Bank has done tons and tons of studies that the impediments to agricultural productivity in Ethiopia, which is about 2.2%. The population growth is 4.5%. And the Ethiopian government says, no, it's not true. It's 5% growth per year. It's not true. The World Bank says, no, it's not true. If Ethiopia is growing its agriculture at 5% per year, it must be the greatest wonder of development in the world. It's not true. But the thing is, they show you analytically that there are bottlenecks in terms of inputs. There are bottlenecks in terms of institutional framework. There are bottlenecks in terms of empowerment, market roads, access.
So you're saying that even if they know that there are human rights abuses, because of some excuses, they're not pushing that side. For me, even if they have national interest, even if they understand that there are some bottlenecks, one thing I don't understand is that, think about it, the donor organizations like countries like the United States and European countries, they have values, great values, values that are very important. We fled, from our countries, come to the United States, for example, is because of her values. Now, how a government which support this kind of values like freedom, the freedom of choice, the freedom of expression, to pursue what you want to pursue, freedom, and so on. So now the government that should support these values, the values that the people of the United States admire and uphold high, why they work with this kind of governments who don't really buy into these values. When you give food for them, and ignore some of the values that are against the values of the donor organizations, you are trumping, you are undermining your own values. So for me, yes, you have interest, that's fine. But what about your values? What about the value of freedom? What about the value of the rule of law? What about the value of justice?
No,
why they ignore that and just give food?
It's a fair question. I think a number of Ethiopians outside the country, ISAT included, have aired this view that you need to live your values. Because when my understanding of what you say is, the reason why you need to live your values in terms of programs, of your aid, leveraging your aid to advance your values, the values of democracy. It is self-interest that really dictates it. Because in the long term, a dictatorial regime is not going to perpetuate your values. It's not going to cement it. Whereas democratic institutions, participation, the rule of law, equity, fairness, equality, all of those really will enable you to have long-term friends. Ethiopia and America have been friends for more than 100 years. The relationship between Ethiopia and the United States didn't start under the EPRDF. On the contrary, it's Ethiopian heroes and the independence of the countries that compelled the United States to acknowledge Ethiopia as an independent country. So I think young people can help us really push at every level, at the grassroots level, in churches, in foundations, with their senators and congressmen, to say, hey, the reason why you need to live your values is because in the long term, the single most important deterrent of terrorism is prosperity in Ethiopia.
Exactly.
And equality in Ethiopia.
Yes, as far as there is poverty,
yes,
there is terrorism.
As far as, yes. Thank you so much. You know what I said about Lula, why I like Lula's statement. As long as there is poverty and hunger, there won't be peace.
Exactly.
Terrorism
also affects developed countries.
Yeah.
It backfires. If they feed, dictators, they yes. don't care about the poor. Yeah. They don't bring prosperity. They don't bring peace. They always, thrive in conflict.
Yeah.
And that leads to poverty. Yeah. That leads to terrorism. Disease now, Ebola.
Yeah.
It affected yes. not only the Western African right. countries. It also right. affects developed countries. Yes. Poverty. It nurtures terrorism.
Yes.
So now, even if the developed countries, they have interest, their interest should be the long term, as you yes. said, the long term interest of their country, which means to foster democracy, yeah. Propagate ideologies and right. values that really finally brings prosperity, stability, and peace. That's when we have, like, for example, middle class right. people in Ethiopia. Yeah. What does that mean? Yeah. It means that they have purchasing power. Right. They can purchase the products and services exactly. of the developed countries.
Yes.
They can come in Ethiopia and invest, foreign direct yeah. investment. Yeah. Without peace, yeah. without middle class, yeah. there is no foreign direct investment. So I see a win-win partnership between developed countries and developing countries like Ethiopia. Yeah. If they make the government accountable and promote values they dearly appreciate and uphold high.
Dr. Asag, you said it. Let me just share with you a contrast between Ethiopia and countries that prospered because they liberalized, they democratized their society, they empowered the poor.
I like that.
They educated the young women to participate. They developed agro-industry. Vietnam is a good example. China overcame, despite the fact that it's a dictatorial regime, there is no poverty. There is no destitution and famine in China. There is, of course, relative poverty. I'm not denying that. India overcame famine through the Green Revolution, right? Okay, why wouldn't, the famous economist laureate, Amartya Sen, said this. I don't want to misquote him. So if you forgive me, let me just share with you what he said. Because what he said really says no famine has ever taken place in a functioning democracy. Democratically elected governments meet the basic needs of their citizens 70% more. 70% more than non-democratic systems. Because citizens participate, they have a vote. If you don't deliver, they kick you out, right?
Yep.
The Ethiopian government system is a one-party dictatorship which perpetuates itself. So it's not open to reform.
By the way, let me interject. The sad thing is that, there are some technocrats, some experts who are appreciating dictators as far as they give, this development lip service. I mean, I like this quotation, I like what you're doing, but there are some other experts who are calling, for example, the late Prime Minister Meles Zenawi a benevolent leader.
Yeah.
So why even experts who are learned, who are exposed to democracy, justice and freedom still appreciate dictators?